9.3. The nature of the written and archaeological sources for slavery. The sources of information for Roman slavery come from a wide geographical area, Rome and Italy, to Asia Minor and Egypt. Written sources. Keith R. Bradley, in The Slavery and the Society of Rome, writes, all historians are victims of their sources, but the historian of Roman slavery is at a special disadvantage, for although a great volume of information is at hand, it is all subject to the fundamental flaw that there is no surviving record, if indeed any ever existed, of what life was like from a slave's point of view. Roman slavery was almost entirely represented from what the historians of a modern slave culture would call pro-slavery sources, items of evidence that reflect the attitudes and prejudices of the slave-owning sectors of society and that contain, at most, minimal sensitivity. Sandra R. Joschel, in Slavery in the Roman World, writes, if we rely on literature and law for our understanding of Roman society, we rely on a story that excludes, for the most part, the position of slaves and lower class Romans. Law and literature do not truly represent the non-privileged. The written sources from which historians have attempted to gain information are covered in the table in 9.1, which I'm going to read for you. Histories. Polybius, the Histories, details Rome's conquest of the 2nd and 3rd centuries BCE. Diodorus Siculus, in Bibliotheca, it was the full story of the first slave revolt in Sicily and conditions of those who worked in the mines. Livia, from the foundation of the city, covers the Carthaginian and Macedonian wars. Tacitus's Annals are an account of the murder of the city prefect Pedanius Secundus by his slave and its repercussions. Suetonius, in the 12th Caesar, talks about the reign of Claudius, the conquest of Britain, and the emperor's freedmen. Florus, the epitome of Roman history, records the first slave war and the Roman war against Spartacus. And Appian, in his Roman history, writes about Spartacus's revolt. Biographies. Plutarch, in the lives of Cato and Crassus, the life of Crassus and the war against Spartacus, and a brief account of how Cato treated his slaves. Letters. Seneca, the Younger, makes dozens of very good and even persuasive points about the treatment of slaves, and Pliny the Younger reveals how he viewed and treated his slaves. Agricultural manuals. Cato the Elder outlines how to manage slave farms or farm slaves. Columelia reveals his attitude to slaves and describes how to house them. Natural history. Pliny the Elder describes gold mining by Roman slaves. Plays. Plautus, in Amphitryon and Persolius, gives a picture of an inconsiderate master and a kind of treatment his slaves were likely to get. Inscriptions, funerary epitaphs on slave collars, inscriptions on punishments, government edicts, reveal the place of a slave in the familia, the manumission of slaves, and the status of freedmen. Roman laws. Gaius Institutes and Justinian's Digest of Roman Laws details the elements of Roman law, the latter compiled by order of the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Emperor Justinian I in the 6th century BC. Here are two views regarding slaves. 1. Seneca was a Roman Stoic philosopher, statesman, tutor, and later advisor to Emperor Nero. Part of his work included a series of moralistic letters. The extracts below reveal his attitude to the treatment of slaves. I am glad to learn through those who come from you that you live on friendly terms with your slaves. This befits a sensible and well-educated man like yourself. They are slaves, people declare. Nay, rather, they are men. Slaves? No, comrades. Slaves? No, they are unpretentious friends. Slaves? No, they are our fellow slaves. If one reflects that fortune has equal rights over slaves and free men alike. That is why I smile at those who think it degrading for a man to dine with his slaves. But why should they think it degrading? It is only because purse-proud etiquette surrounds a householder at his dinner with a mob of standing slaves. All this time the poor slaves may not even move their lips, even to speak. The slightest murmur is repressed by the rod. Even a chance sound, a cough, a sneeze, or a hiccup, is visited with the lash. There is a grievous penalty for the slightest breach of silence. All night long they must stand about, hungry and dumb. I shall pass over other cruel and inhuman conduct towards them, for we maltreat them, not as if they were men, but as if they were beasts of burden. When we recline at a banquet, one slave mops up the disgorged food, another crouches beneath the table and gathers up the leftovers of the tipsy guests. I do not wish to involve myself in too large a question, and to discuss the treatment of slaves, towards whom we Romans are excessively haughty, cruel, and insulting. But this is the kernel of my advice. Treat your inferiors as you would be treated by your betters. Associate with your slave on kindly, even on affable terms. Let him talk with you, plan with you, live with you. Pliny the Younger wrote and published a series of letters to influence the people in imperial Rome. But although he does not devote one letter to slavery, by reading them all, one can get a typical aristocratic view of slaves. He considered himself a considerate owner of slaves on his various estates, and claimed that he was worn out by the illness of his slaves, and deaths as well, including those of some who were quite young, but he still regarded them as lazy, unreliable, and possibly brutal. Slaves were important to Pliny as a means to an end. The labour that slaves provided, and the skills that slaves possessed, promoted Pliny's political opportunities and provided the income by which Pliny maintained his luxurious lifestyle and political connections. His benevolent management of slaves provided an opportunity to express his virtues to the Roman reading his letters. Pliny's letters were politically motivated. Archaeological sources. Although there is an abundance of material remains available, there are also problems with them because it is often difficult to identify individual men, women and children as slaves in sculpture, relief and painting. These material remains range from small artifacts such as mosaics, coins, sculptures and slave paraphernalia to the large and monumental such as amphitheatres. Mosaics depict gladiators fighting and being torn to pieces by wild beasts, slaves attending to their masters and mistresses inside the home, slaves accompanying female members of the household out of the home, slaves pouring wine and performing other domestic duties, slaves entertaining at banquets, and the way slaves were dressed. Sculptures depict Roman soldiers leading bound captives, slaves attending their masters and mistresses, trading vessels, slaves serving wine, funerary portraits of freedmen, funerary stela. Some of the artifacts associated with slaves include shackles, slave collars, helmets worn by the Mamilio gladiator, and buildings include amphitheatres in Rome, Italy, and the provinces, brothels, which were places of prostitution.